I said to one of the other families who's part of the Colonial Parkway murders is not yet solved. I did say to one of them, by the way, when you get this news, and I'm very optimistic, and I know Kristin is too, that we're going to see more solves in the Colonial Parkway murders. And we both believe that Wilmer will be tied into other unsolved homicides and sexual assaults. But I said, it isn't going to change your life, the knowing part. Am I feeling better about the situation? Absolutely. And do I appreciate the work that's gone into this and the incredible dedication of the FBI and Virginia State Police teams? Absolutely. I wish we could handle things in a way where I know the FBI struggles because they think they're in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. Mm-hmm. But families like mine deserve answers. And I don't think what we're asking for is unreasonable. And it's very unfortunate. I feel like we're once again getting the straight arm from the Bureau, and that doesn't feel good at all.
Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well, Ray. A little tired from the past week, but I'm rejuvenated because we're doing one of our well-known occasional crossover episodes with our friends from Mind Over Murder. And boy, do they have some good news tonight to share. And I say good, but it's advancing news of things that they've been talking about for a long time. Why don't you introduce them, Ray?
Absolutely. Last month, we sat in this studio with Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley to build a victimology profile for Kathy Thomas and Becky Dowski. We talked about the who of the victims, hoping to find a way towards the killer. Today, the who has a name, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. For a third, the Colonial Parkway murders held a shadow over Virginia. Now, thanks to advanced DNA testing, the FBI has confirmed that Wilmer, a local fisherman who died in 2017, is the man responsible for the 1986 murders of Kathy and Becky, as well as several other cases. Today, as Jim said, we're joined by our good friends, Bill and Kristin, from the podcast Mind Over Murder. The Bureau finally opened their books. Bill, tell us what that first meeting was like.
Well, it's still kind of settling in, Ray and Fitz. It's been a couple of weeks, but we got a phone call about 3 weeks ago now asking us if members of the Thomas and Dowski families could travel to Norfolk, Virginia, where the FBI office is located. It's actually in Chesapeake, which is right next door to Norfolk, to get an update on Kathy and Becky's case. They, as usual, played their cards very close to the vest, but they asked if I could get down there, and any of my siblings or other family members that wanted to attend were also invited. And I explained to the FBI that my older brother had just died a couple of months ago, so he wasn't going to be able to attend. And my younger brother, Jack, was in the hospital awaiting some heart surgery, so he was not going to be able to attend. So it ended up being just myself. And then Bob Dowski, who is the older brother of Becky Dowski, my sister's girlfriend, and the two women, my sister Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, were killed together in October 1986. So this was designed as an update, and no information was provided in advance. So we kind of went in cold in terms of what they were going to share with us.
Did I hear right, Bill? Was there a Bureau plane involved?
They offered to fly us in, no FBI plane, but they said they would pay for us to fly down to Norfolk, and they put us up for the night prior to the meeting. So we flew down there, I guess it's about 3 weeks ago now. I flew down there on a Monday and met on Tuesday morning.
You were probably a restless sleep of night for you. You let a lot of restless sleeps a nights of sleep for you going back to 1986. Tell us what that was like and when you first walked in the FBI office.
Well, the whole thing is just kind of, it's a very strange experience. Yeah, very much a restless night's sleep the night before in the hotel. And we went in and we got there for 8:30 in the morning, went through a very strict security protocol. They insisted that we not bring in any cell phones, iPads, anything like that, no recording devices. And quite frankly, I was so in a frazzle with all of their very strict rules that I didn't even dare bring in a piece of paper. I just went in, completely barehanded, and they put all your electronic devices in a locker and then send you in. I realized afterward they were timing this right to the minute. They kept us waiting, chatting with one of the assistant special agents in charge for 15 minutes or more. And then I realized later they were actually timing it so they brought us in exactly at 9 a.m. And one of the reasons for that was they made a decision, which I disagree with, to drop a press release at 9 a.m. without our knowledge. They told us about it after it had gone out, which unfortunately, right off the bat, created a problem for the families in that we were not given an opportunity to contribute to the press release. There was no press conference. And unfortunately, because they did what they did, our families who were waiting to hear from us, Bob and myself, for the Dowski and Thomas families, didn't learn about what had happened to Kathy and Becky from us. They found out about it via the World Wide Web, because the minute the press release went out, their phones started ringing and people said, have you seen the news? Kathy and Becky were killed by Alan Wade Wilmer, which is a name we were very familiar with. But it's an unfortunate way to start off a meeting, and it really threw the two of us off.
I get it.
I do too. Bill, with that said, did they tell you why they did that? Did you ask them?
No, I was very challenging. As you know, my relationship with the FBI is a very direct one.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at the SAC across the table, and after she had said some very important things, first few sentences out of the SAC's mouth were, "I'm going to cut to the chase here." Or something like that, not said in a disrespectful way. She said, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for the deaths of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. And, as we the first few minutes of the meeting went along, there were about 7 agents and staff on their side of the table, Bob Dowski and I on our side of the table. I said, are you not having a press conference? And she said, no. And I said, I may have even pointed. I said, you need to have a press conference. I can't believe you're not having a press conference. The Virginia State Police, same suspect, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., they've had 2 press conferences in the last 2 years announcing various solves in the Colonial Parkway murders and other related cases. They've already had 2 live press conferences. You're telling me you're not having a press conference? And I said to her directly, you need to take questions live on camera to answer the many, many questions press, media, and the families have. But they just looked at me blankly like, no, we're not going to do that. And they didn't even really respond to my kind of challenge in any meaningful way. Clearly don't want to hear it. And frankly, clearly they don't want to hear from me.
So I'm a little confused. They went out to the media, but just through a standard FBI press release, not a press conference.
Absolutely correct. And we had no opportunity, unlike the Virginia State Police press conferences, which have happened twice in the last 2 years, as they've made advances in other cases as part of the Colonial Parkway murders. The families were allowed to participate in those press conferences, were allowed to contribute statements, kind of indicating how they'd like their loved ones to be remembered. We were not afforded that opportunity. We were not afforded any opportunity to speak live to the press. No press were invited. It was very, very weird. But this is unfortunately fairly typical of the way the families have been treated in the Colonial Parkway murders, specifically by the FBI. The Virginia State Police have actually been much more
empathetic
and respectful, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very frustrating. And even as we speak, now I asked for a follow-up discussion, and it's been nearly 2 weeks, and they haven't even responded to my inquiry as to when can we expect to be able to ask follow-up questions. Interestingly, Bob Dowski, my colleague from the Dowski family, was afforded that opportunity and spent 2 hours on the phone with the FBI a few days after our meeting, and they've refused to afford me the same courtesy.
You think it's personal?
Well, I'll be frank as always, Ray. I have been very critical of FBI Norfolk and the way they've handled this case, have felt the need Remember, it's been 39 years since Kathy and Becky were murdered, and there have been a lot of problems in this case. And I have been forced, in my opinion, to point out the problems and to call out their foot dragging. So I don't know. I mean, is it personal? I have no way of knowing, but they sure seem to be going out of their way to make sure that I don't get answers to any of the many questions I have. And they've afforded me no opportunity to speak. And it's very frustrating to just be blocked at every opportunity. Even as we speak today, I'm now closing in. It'll be 2 weeks and a couple of days since I asked for a follow-up meeting. And it's been more than 2 weeks since Bob Dowski already had a follow-up. So we're not getting equal treatment, that's for sure.
Well, when we ended our crossover podcast, was it November or December that we did it?
December.
When some new information came in. And Bill, quite frankly, at the end, we gave you some room, and you were very critical of our former agency, but if they deserve it, they deserve it. And we didn't stop you, if you recall.
No, you guys have been great.
I thought somehow we'd come on today, finally, after a few misstarts doing this, that all would be forgiven. Because you have the news you wanted to hear.
Yes.
Remember, it's not good news, but it adds some level of closure, of course. Yet why the hell is the Bureau just playing this, being so obtrusive to you in terms of where you're going? And I don't, whether it's personal, I don't know. Things you said in the past, I don't know. But they could have made this such a positive moment, is my point.
Exactly.
Everything behind that, forget it.
It could have been a moment of healing, Jim. I agree.
And
it could have been a moment where everybody healed at the same time.
Yeah. And hey, press conference, this is good news. We solved the case. Here are the family members. Media ask away, or family members ask us in front of the media, however you want to do it. If they could answer the questions, they could. If they didn't, but at least they'd be out there in public. This wasn't the Bureau that I remembered from 18 some years ago. But be that as it may, but I suppose perhaps we can focus on the news that you did learn and the closure, if that's the right word. Only you can tell us whether it's closure or not, but after 39 years. But yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe some folks will hear this and they'll give another chance. I don't know. But I guess they didn't do it last time in December when we were all together, giving you another chance. So I don't know what to make of this. They were nice to call you. They offered to fly you down, put you up. They didn't even have to do that, I suppose. They could have told you on the phone, but they did this part. But the ball was dropped somewhere from the communication department.
Let's move in a direction, and maybe you can answer this, Bill and/or Kristin. What was the evidence that they told you and the investigative techniques that they used that helped solve this case?
Well, there's a couple of things, and there is good news in the mix here, Ray and Fitz, and I'm sorry that we end up, with this unnecessary conflict. They didn't share a lot of information with us, which has been our experience over all these years. But here's what they did say. I asked them directly which outside lab did the DNA work, and they answered that question in a straightforward manner, which I really appreciate. All I want to do is ask questions and get answers, and I can move on. So the answer was DNA Labs International out of Florida, who are a highly respected lab, and they did the outside work. DNA Labs International, by the way, is the lab that's done all of the other lab work in the Virginia State Police cases. They used a Sankey grant, and they arranged this through the Virginia State Police because of whatever the technicalities are regarding the feds cannot use a sexual assault kit initiative grant, but the Virginia State Police can. That's my understanding. So DNA Labs International did the work. They said that they retested evidence in Kathy and Becky's case. Specifically, they were looking at the interior of my sister Kathy's 1980 Honda Civic and the clothing that they were wearing at the time of their murder. And they said that evidence that they tested previously was retested. And of course, as we all know, and we're seeing this, and this is exciting news, that the tests are getting so much more refined that you're able to find evidence that you couldn't find as recently as 5 years ago. So apparently around 2011, I think it was, they had tested Kathy and Becky's clothing and had not found any evidence that would tie into a particular suspect. They went back and retested the evidence, and what they told us was that they found Wilmer's DNA on Becky's bra, which she would have been wearing under a T-shirt and a kind of a sporty windbreaker. Both women were big athletes, and that the DNA was found on Becky's bra, which obviously Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. does not belong inside Kathy and Becky's car. His DNA does not belong on her bra. When we asked what type of DNA it was, they refused to answer the question. And we just don't understand, was it semen? Was it saliva? Was it touch DNA? What was it? I don't think these are unreasonable questions, but they refuse to answer.
And there's no trial coming up. So
that's what I said.
Which I would understand them holding back a bit if there was a subsequent trial. So anyway, Ray, I interrupted.
Well, and as Kristin can chime in here, there's the possibility, which we acknowledge, that there could be accomplices, and some of these accomplices might still be alive. But I said over the table, I don't understand why you're refusing to answer these questions. Exactly as you said, Jim. No one's going to trial. Wilmer's been dead since 2017. We're kind of left scratching our heads.
Kristin, you've been an observer for a long time here in this case with Bill. And I want to ask, how does it feel with you to finally see the pieces fit together?
I have lived with this case because I'm a local. I've lived with this case since I was old enough to be aware of this case. And I have lived closely with the case as Bill's podcast partner for the last 10 years. And it was so unbelievably fulfilling to see this happen because I have prayed for this day for Bill since we started working together. I found myself in tears because this is what Bill has wanted. This is what he has worked for our entire partnership. And to know that finally Bill and Bob and everybody who loves the two women, we're going to get the answers. Maybe not full answers, maybe not satisfactory answers, but that they finally had answers. So it was a strange mix of being joyful because finally there are answers, but also very sad as well, because now we know that the person that we've been discussing and whose picture we've been looking at for the last 2 years is the last person that Kathy and Becky saw. And I hate knowing that for them, but I am so glad that we have answers because I am hoping that it's a weight off of my partner's mind and spirit.
Well, and thank you, Kristin. And a lot of what you said made me smile. And let's be clear. I cannot thank the FBI and Virginia State Police and DNA Labs International and the entire team enough for this incredible work. And knowing is much better than not knowing. Yeah. And so there is some relief. As you all know, I'm not terribly comfortable with closure. I said to one of the other families whose part of the Colonial Parkway murders is not yet solved, I did say to one of them, by the way, when you get this news, and I'm very optimistic, and I know Kristin is too, that we're going to see more solves in the Colonial Parkway murders. And we both believe that Wilmer will be tied into other unsolved homicides and sexual assaults. But I said, it isn't going to change your life, the knowing part. Am I feeling better about the situation? Absolutely. And do I appreciate the work that's gone into this and the incredible dedication of the FBI and Virginia State Police teams? Absolutely. I wish we could handle things in a way where I know the FBI struggles because they think they're in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. Mm-hmm. But families like mine deserve answers. And I don't think what we're asking for is unreasonable. And it's very unfortunate. I feel like we're once again getting the straight arm from the Bureau, and that doesn't feel good at all.
Bill, I kind of agree with you, but it wasn't really the Bureau that solved this as much as it was the forensic breakthroughs. Mm-hmm. And the ability for science to move forward to a point where they could do those tests that were going to be helpful in solving this case. Without that, we'd still be talking about, the profile of the individual that did this, the victimology of the victims. And going to that, how do you think the things Jim and I said and others that you have talked to, both you and Chris, about the profile we kind of built around who may have done this without knowing the name? How do you feel that those pieces fit in? Do they fit in better now? Does it seem like we were on target, or were we off base?
Well, I think you were on target. And both Kristen and I are very intensely curious if we can find a way to match up Wilmer's profile and his DNA with other unsolved murders. We've got 2 more double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders, the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. That's incident number 3 in the Colonial Parkway murder series. And then the murder of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, which is incident number 4 in the Colonial Parkway murders, as well as other murders that took place. Kristen had coined this phrase, Colonial Parkway murders adjacent cases. We didn't mean that in a disrespectful way. We were just looking at the 4 double homicides that are considered the Colonial Parkway murders. And then there's these other unsolved murders of individuals that were happening at the same time. And now we've seen that some of those are also clearly Wilmer. We're up to 6 now. But I think your profile was pretty spot on. Kristen said before we started this afternoon that she'd love to see this case reprofiled with a focus on Wilmer, because we both think Wilmer is likely going to be linked to other homicides and sexual assaults if we can get past this restriction we've already run into, which is that because Wilmer was never convicted of a crime, according to Virginia state law, he can't be put into the CODIS system for additional DNA search. And we think there's got to be a workaround there to be able to take a look at Wilmer as a potential suspect in other cases.
So one of the things that I have sort of taken it upon myself to do in the last couple of days while Bill has been sort of fielding media and everything like that, is I have started looking at other cold cases around here, Parkway adjacent ones like Brian Pettinger, and then cases even further afield, like down in North Carolina, that seem to match Wilmer's MO. We're hoping that maybe if Wilmer is found good for Amber Lundgren, where the suspect sketch and the truck sketch very, very closely mirror Wilmer, maybe North Carolina can put him in CODIS. I think that there are workarounds there, but one of the things that I've really been sort of re-energized by in the last 3 weeks since we got this news is trying to figure out, who else might Wilmer be good for here? And obviously, I'm not an investigator. I'm not an agent. I'm not anything like that. I'm just a determined person who has a hunch that he's probably good for more than we've actually seen. And so my big focus now is how many others can we try to pin him to? And the profile that you guys came up with has definitely informed my thinking, especially, you guys use the term an apex predator and an opportunistic offender. And that has really made me broaden my thinking beyond, we're not just looking at couples anymore. And we may not even just be looking at women anymore, like Teresa and Laurie. I think it's entirely possible he might be good for Brian Pettinger, which extends him out into, single men as well. Definitely, you guys have helped me broaden out my thinking. We're not looking at a rigid, set of in circumstances. He could have been anywhere doing anything. So that has helped a lot, having y'all's input.
Well, the MO is going to be your window. That's going to be your window into looking at all these things. And, to reprofile this is not really reprofiling it. You're looking at the MO. You look at what he's finally been attached to, which is your sister's and her friend's murder. And you look at that and you say, what other murders are similar? And they don't have to be exact. They just have to be similar. And then I think one way, the first thing that popped up in my mind about how to work around that bill is, and the Bureau can help with this, is serving subpoenas for a sample in that case as it relates to that case. If it's a state case, they could do that. Now, when you look at this case here, what happened, and Jim, help me with this a little bit. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it was probably back in the mid-2000s, Jim, where they actually added a classification in our classifications of serial killer cases. Remember about when that was, Jim? Was that 2005?
The 2000s. Yeah, I forget the exact date. And it did give the FBI more broad investigative powers. We didn't have to wait just to be called in by local police to help that, which, we would gladly do back then. And again, in the early days with this case, that's all the FBI's involvement was. Was it domestic police cooperation, Ray? That's how
The DPC, yeah.
It would come under any category, but they'd have to ask us in, and then then we could take over not take over, but we could work in conjunction with them from there. But now with their own serial killer classification. When I left, where I was about 250 separate classifications of what the FBI does.
The serial killer was like 306, 307, 308, 309.
You left after I did.
So we're 300. Yeah, I did. I left about
Some
5
people
years
say the
later.
FBI has too many classifications and crimes they work, but that's another story. So yeah, that definitely made a difference in that regard, adding that classification for us to do things. But Kristin, let me add here and follow up with what Ray was saying. And this sounds like common sense, but I really learned this anecdotally and experientially through a number of cases of all different ilk I've worked over the years, from bank robberies to, in fact, serial rape cases to even serial killer cases. And that is the earliest and first crime, again, whatever it may be in this serial case, is the one that will probably leave the most evidence or be most reflective / indicative of the persona, the profile of the individual at hand. And we may have discussed some of this before. And in rape cases, it's tough because, as we know, some women don't always report rapes. And certainly in the past, there were some legitimate reasons for not doing that. And I'm not talking about boyfriend rapes. They're bad enough as it is if it is classified as a rape, a criminal activity, but certainly even stranger rapes. And Ray, we heard some of that in the Center City Rapist case issues going back in the summertime, that 20-part series we did last year. But if in fact the earliest rape murder, and Kristin, of all the ones you described, what's the earliest one date-wise? They obviously would, I believe, predate Cindy and Becky's murder. The one in North Carolina, when did that occur?
No, Kathy and Becky's was the earliest. Amber Lundgren is 1997. So Kathy and Becky are the first.
All right. Well, 39 years later, some of the mistakes he made with that case through DNA analysis, which wasn't even thought of back then, came through. Okay, I thought some of these cases may have predated those. But let me just say this up front. I wouldn't be surprised if other cases did. We just may not know.
Nor would we.
Yeah.
Jim, we agree. There's even a case from 85, which would be the year before Kathy and Becky's murder, the murder up in the Rappahannock area of a woman named Mary Keyser Harding. And interestingly, Wilmer's older brother, William Keith Wilmer, who went by his middle name, was a strong suspect in this 1985 murder, which is actually closer to the Lancaster County area of Virginia, where the Wilmer family is from. Another man was convicted of that murder, but after 31 years in jail, the Innocence Project was able to prove that this man, Emerson Stevens, was not responsible for Mary Keyser Harding's murder, and that, interestingly, Keith Wilmer, Alan's older brother, is actually on the short list of suspects. Unfortunately, he also died recently in April 2025. So we both think that it's quite possible there may be additional rapes and homicides that are associated with the Wilmers, plural, that may predate Kathy and Becky's murder. So you may very well be right. We're trying to move both backwards and forwards here to try to figure out, like, when does this guy's spree, if you want to call it that, begin and end? But we think there's definitely more to it. Will the FBI and the Virginia State Police continue to follow up? I think they will, but right now they're not communicating much of that to the families.
It would certainly be incumbent upon these local police departments predating Becky and Cindy's homicides and certainly subsequent to that, to want to close these cases out and look at the viable suspects that even other agencies or other influencers can somehow bring to the surface. Yeah, it was bothersome, Kristin, when you said earlier about, that the feds would not, I think you told me the feds won't allow to put sexual assault kit DNA into databases if they're not convicted. Is that correct?
As we understand it, it's actually a Commonwealth of Virginia law that's standing in the way of putting Alan Wade Wilmer's DNA into CODIS right now.
You know what, Bill? I got a great idea. You've been carrying this flag for the whole 39 years, and rightfully so. You know what? I think that you should take this to the legislation and call
Right.
it the Kathy and Becky law.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And do something like that. Get see your congressmen, the senators. That's not a big deal to do something like that. And let your sister's name live in infamy, and let her be the reason why others are saved or why other families have closure like you've had. I think that
Yep.
would be a great idea for your
Yeah.
sister's legacy and for Becky's legacy too.
Well, it's something we're thinking about.
Yeah,
We
for
would
sure.
this would have to be changed as we understand it at the state level. So
Mhm.
we'd have to be dealing with the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Mhm.
We had met with the Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia last year, and he was very open to it. He did say the timing wasn't great because it was late in the legislative session. Now we have a new legislature that have just been sworn in
Mhm.
Virginia. Interestingly, we've had a shift over from that group of people at the AG's office to a newly elected AG. But I think that we would be met with some positive response
Yep.
because the families are determined to see this thing through. We've been trying to deal with a lot. But I appreciate what you're saying, Ray, about the fact that that would be a noble cause. And it is
Absolutely.
something we are thinking about. And I would hope that the new Attorney General would be as supportive as the previous AG. It's something we're definitely thinking about. Of course, we've got a lot of stuff going on right about now, and that is definitely on our list of things to do.
I wish you luck with that, Bill, because the new governor and legislators in Virginia and the Commonwealth are actually working to prohibit some further investigation of some groups and tied in with, some fraud cases, whatever. And we don't have to get into that whole can of worms, if you will, but I'll just say good luck with that. And I hope you can get through all the jetsam and flotsam and get this legislation going. And hopefully they would see this as very, very specific to solving crimes of, in many cases, assaults against women. And let's get these things underway, and they can have protective measures. And, these comparisons can only be made in certain types of cases with perhaps subpoenas or court orders or something like that. So hopefully there'll be some kind of a compromise in that regard.
Yeah.
So good luck with that.
The families have always resisted politicizing the Colonial Parkway murders. I mean, the 8 families, we're, everything from conservative Republicans to progressive Democrats and every stop in between. We've always worked together very effectively, even though we all come at this from a variety of different perspectives. One thing I'm a little bit hesitant about is working with the legislature. If this is going to turn into a political football, we kind of want nothing to do with that. I think everyone, regardless of their political persuasion, would like to see cases like ours solved. And this isn't about who we voted for. It's who's going to step up and give the Colonial Parkway murders families, plural, a hand in, finding a way to put Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s DNA into the CODA system. One other suggestion that's been made to us in the last few weeks is that we might be able to finesse this via a court order, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. It sounds like our work is not through, not by a long shot.
No, it's not. And I mean, when Bill got the news that he was going to go into the FBI office, and I figured right away, I said, buddy, it's going to be a solve. And he was like, no, don't get my hopes up. And I said, it's going to be a solve. I told him the day before he went, and I said, this doesn't mean we're done. Even if they solve Kathy and Becky, we're still not done. We have the Calls and the Haleys, the Phelpses and the Lowers. They deserve answers too. And then every other Wilmer victim out there, they deserve to have answers as well. So we are so not done. In fact, if you listen to what Bill said just now, we're busier than ever. But it's work that I think we're happy to take on because it's so needed. And we want every family out there to, have their day in which they understand exactly what happened to their loved one. So we're not finished in any way, shape, or form.
Kristin, in view of that, maybe we can save the details for another crossover episode between Cold Red and Mind Over Murder. But we've been sharing some emails now for a few months.
Yes.
And maybe we can scratch the surface here that it may go beyond the Wilmer brothers, that of some other murders being committed in the whole Colonial Parkway milieu, if you will, and or adjacent. Would you care to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we kind of want to play this a little close to the vest, but we definitely think that there are relationships between Wilmer and other known offenders in the area that are worth exploring. They are people that were on the FBI's radar back in the day, if you will, because they put themselves there. And we think that their involvement in the case is worth a second or third look. And that is something that we're hoping the Bureau is willing to do. And we hope that's something the Virginia State Police is willing to do as well. But we do think that Wilmer may have had some accomplices, some of whom are living, some of whom are dead, but we are hoping that the Bureau and the VSP are open to listening to us as we lay out some of the information that we have gathered from locals who have come forward and said, hey, I know that you know about Wilmer, but do you know about this guy and this guy and this guy who are also affiliated with Wilmer? And so I think that there's the potential for this to be bigger than it already is, but we don't want to spill names or anything out just yet.
Now, I mentioned two people by name over the table with the FBI, and they definitely recognize both names, one living, one dead. But at the end of the meeting, I pulled aside our case agent, whom I like quite a bit and is very smart. And she's only been handling the case for the last 2 years or so, but she's very much on top of it. And she was very interested in continuing that conversation. So we're actually working on developing some leads that we received. Interestingly, I know you've run into this, guys. There are people that are willing to talk to us, the families, and particularly to Kristin and me, because of our work on Mind Over Murder, that aren't necessarily 100% comfortable talking to law enforcement. Now, obviously, we want them to talk to law enforcement about any of the information they have to share. But sometimes it takes a while to kind of coach these people into being willing to step forward and provide their information to law enforcement. Some of these folks have had negative experiences with law enforcement, or they themselves might have a somewhat sketchy background or what have you. And our concern is trying to get that information to the investigators that can actually do something about it. But sometimes that takes a while. I'm going to be heading back to Virginia in the next couple of months, and Kristin and I are going to be sitting down with some of these people, and we're going to be urging them to tell us what they know, but most importantly, to communicate that to the investigators that are actually handling the case. We think there are living suspects in Virginia now that actually may be attached to this murder series. Kristin's actually said, as bizarre as it sounds, these men seem to almost be working on this together in like a murder club. And I know the two of you push back on that, but stranger things have happened, and certainly some of these accomplices need to be checked out.
Well, let me ask you both a question, the same question for both of you. Having been involved in this for a while, what's the most surprising piece of information that came to you that had not been in the public file? If you can talk about it.
I'm going to let Kristin go first so I can think about a good answer.
No, I have to think about a good answer too. You're the one who was in the meeting, not me. I never got into the room.
Well, here's one interesting thing. Bob Dowski, my colleague from the Dowski family, he's Becky's oldest brother. He was rock solid certain this was going to be another suspect. And he was really thrown off, he told me later, that it wasn't the suspect. Again, we're not naming names here. It wasn't the suspect that he thought it was going to be. Interestingly, I walked into the meeting with maybe a bit of more of an open mind. I'm not criticizing Bob when I say that, but I was surprised it was Wilmer. But then again, given the fact that it had already been linked to 4 homicides, including 2, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, who are considered part of the Colonial Parkway murders, I wasn't like going to fall out of my chair when they told us it was Wilmer. And I'm fairly certain Wilmer will be identified as the offender at a minimum, I think, in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, because he was a suspect within days of the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. The FBI had him solidly on their radar back in 1988.
Chris?
Yeah. I think I'm sort of torn between two answers, and I think one I'm just going to keep for private consumption with you guys, not public consumption for the rest of the internet. I would say definitely the one that I was most surprised about is when Bill was asking questions about where they thought Kathy and Becky were killed. Bill and I have always thought that it was in a closed-off picnic area called the Ringfield Plantation site. And the agents didn't seem to think that that was the case. They seemed to think that the place where Kathy and Becky were killed, the primary crime scene, was in one of the Half Moon pull-offs that's like really, really close to the road. And I was very surprised that they thought it was something that is that immediately visible to anybody driving by. You can hear a car maybe, 15, 20 seconds before you see it. They didn't seem to think it was in this very secluded area that we have always thought it was. They're sure it was right where the car was left. And I was really surprised by that. I'm wondering if maybe that's just information they're keeping back from us. But I don't know. They seem to think that it was sort of right out in the open. That was a little surprising to me.
All right. Are you ready for another question? All right. At both of you. Now, when you look at Alan Wade Wilmer, he was just a local fisherman. Okay. And he was a hunter. He had no prior criminal record for violence. With that said, how does that affect society's assumptions and law enforcement's assumptions about who commits violent crimes? Not so much regionally, but universally.
Well, in talking to family members, interestingly, the Wilmer family reached out to me 2 years ago when his name was first announced as being associated with these murders. And I've spoken multiple times to his family, his ex-wife, his daughter, his former daughter-in-law. One of the family members said to me, it's almost like there's two Allens. There's the man that they knew up in Lancaster County. He has some priors, they're misdemeanors. Some of them may have been pled down to a lower level of charges, but he's not a guy with a public history of violence, certainly nothing extreme. It sounds like he might have gotten in some fights and things like that as a younger man. But they feel like there's a disconnect between the Wilmer who ends up on the peninsula where the Colonial Parkway murders were committed. This is after his wife divorces him, and he moves down to the Colonial Parkway area where he's working as a waterman, as they call them. And he seems to make some sort of transition over to this extremely violent, scary guy, which wasn't apparent in his younger days. And that part there, they even said, it's almost like there's two Allens, like Jekyll and Hyde almost. Yeah. And perhaps precipitating events might include his wife breaking up with him, which she said even to the last days of his life, he never understood why his wife divorced him. And then he had a girlfriend who broke up with him shortly before the Colonial Parkway murders began. And she ended up marrying another man and moving away. And apparently he took that very hard. So I think there's precipitating events that might result in him lashing out in the way that he did. I'm sure Kristin might have some thoughts too.
No, I think, very similarly to what Bill is saying, I think that we have to change our idea of what a serial killer looks like typically. And I think that's something that we've had to do, since the advent of shows like Criminal Minds and so on and so forth, which of course I'm a big fan of. And of course Fitz was involved with. I think a lot of people still have this idea in their head that a serial killer is meant to look or act a certain way. But I think there's a lot more seemingly nice guys on the surface who are harboring some really dark, violent sides to them. I'm guessing that there are probably more people out there than we would like to think that have that dark side of their personality. And as someone who, survived an abusive relationship with someone like that, who had a dark side to his personality, I can attest to that. He is, Mr. Everything to everybody on the outside, but inside, you don't want to know that guy. So I think we really need to continue to, emphasize this idea that serial killers, they really do sort of look and act like the rest of us. And a lot of times you might not see it. And I think that somehow makes it scarier.
Yeah, just in some cases I worked, I mean, you had, Professor Kaczynski, who was actually a mad bomber. I mean, he did that years later. As Raiden out in Wichita, Kansas. I just watched a special on him. I worked that case too a little bit back in the day with some language aspects to the letters he was writing. He was a regular, Boy Scout leader and coach and everything there. And I mean, we can go down the list. There are some other people that, lived more on the rougher side of life and they, almost predictable to them. But now I think we've all learned over the years that there is no one cookie cutter for serial killers, and depending how they go about it, how violent they are, or they do it more subtly or long distance, like with bombs and whatever. So I certainly know as I was leaving the FBI and imparting to people back then, and even nowadays when I still teach, it's like let the evidence speak for itself. What mom and dad tell you, or even husband and wife might tell you about someone doesn't necessarily mean that's who they are. I still like to live, and we can probably wind things up here, but in most cases, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. But you have to know what that past behavior is, and you have to know how psychologically oriented it is. And there may be some sort of cathartic moment in their 20s or 30s that all of a sudden the life as they were living it, following everyone else's rules and obeying mom and dad, maybe strict, parents and other authoritarian figures in their personal lives, that something goes wrong and they're finally on their own, like our guy Wilmer, when he finally was divorced, living in a new area, the real Wilmer comes out. Yeah, so we have to keep looking in those type of dark places and identify these people. The ones that we've described here are the ones that get away with it. They're the ones we talk about on podcast and certainly in criminal investigations. The ones that are very obvious or sloppy, certainly in the beginning, they get caught right away, and they never get serial attached to their killer status as they go along. They're one and done. Yeah, fascinating stuff here. I know there's more to go. And Kristin, what you told Bill clearly day after he got this phone call, whatever they tell you, Bill, it ain't over. You were probably more grammatically correct. You teach English and writing, I know, but the thought was there. Yeah, interesting case. Anything to wind up here? I know we have another.
I do. Yeah, we
up.
do have something else we have to do. I want to take a moment and tribute to both Kathy Thomas and Becky Dowski and other victims of both solved and unsolved crimes in the Capitol Parkway murders and other areas around there. Just a moment of silence, if you could, please. Bill, Kristin, I am so happy that there's a smidgen of closure for this to you. I know that your work is just beginning, and I know you have many, many more things to do. And Jim and I and Cold Red are here to help support you guys in any way we can.
Thank you so much.
We'll be talking again soon, I'm sure, on Mind Over Murder, or perhaps back on Cold Red, or back when we do it together. Everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Cold Red and Mind Over Murder. Thanks to our producers, Matt Robinson, Matt McLaughlin, our music coordinator, Rick Schilling, and like us, subscribe to us, share us, all those type things on coldredpodcast.com. And we will see you next time on Cold Red.